So the new format is here, and Kashtira is looking to be one of the best decks in the format, but is it really worth spending all that money on this deck? What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Cards and Coffee. Today, I'm going to be digging into my pure Kashtira deck profile. We're going to go through the card by card. I'm going to talk about exactly what I'm playing and why I'm playing it. And hopefully by the end of this, not only will you guys have an idea of what this deck can do and some of the tech choices you guys can play, but whether or not you guys should really invest in picking up this deck, because while no deck is perfect, this deck definitely has some flaws. But of course, before all that, guys, as always, please go grab yourself a cup of coffee or something. That way you guys can sit down and tune in. Let's do this. Alright, so Kashtira is here. I've actually really been enjoying this deck. Yes, there's some degenerate things about it with the floodgate aspect and of course locking out zones, but the deck is fairly simple. There's a lot of different avenues you can kind of accomplish the combos you're trying to do, but the playstyle is pretty simple and straightforward, looking for card advantage with simple 1-for-1s. But of course, one of the glaring issues of this deck is of course losing to a lot of these board breaker type cards. Sure, it plays around droplets because you have a macro Cosmos on legs, but you still have to deal with stuff like Evenly Matched, Book of Eclipse, Lava Golem, Sphere Mode, heck, even Triple Tactics Talents and Econ. All those cards like Change of Heart that just take your monsters are so insane against this deck as well. I think if you take the conservative route with this deck and you don't put everything on the field at once, this deck can actually grind with all of the best decks of the format. And of course, there's also some auto win buttons this deck has included. So now hopping right into things, of course, for our Kashtira monsters, we're going to be playing 3 of our Fenrir, 3 of our Unicorn, 3 of the Rise Heart, 1 of the Tearlament, and 1 Scareclaw. Now, I think these ratios are all pretty standard. Of course, the Unicorns and the Fenrirs are staple, being your main searchers for the deck. These are actually some of my favorite cards in the deck just because of how good they are by themselves, but the fact that you have a deck that's revolved around these cards as well to really abuse them to their full potential is what, to me, makes this deck so much fun to play. Now, of course, moving on to the newer cards, we have the Rise Hearts, the Tearlament, and the Scareclaw. I think this ratio is actually pretty standard. Some people will cut the Rise Heart to 2, which I guess you can get away with, especially if you're trying to squeeze stuff in like the adventure package into this deck. But personally, I love drawing this card, and if I draw it, then that means I don't have to search it for the combo. Plus, it's something that if there is something on my field, it is still something I can normal summon, which does help with resolving your Theosis. But to me, this is just such an important combo piece for the deck, not only banishing your trap card to bring back your Exceed materials, but also having the ability to remove any of your cards from your deck. That way you can add it back with your Theosis when it gets banished. Makes this card one of the most versatile cards after you've been established. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the Tearlaments and the Scareclaw. Obviously, they're extenders and they all have their own role. The Tearlaments will mill and the Scareclaw can attack and defense while also negating effects, which is pretty neat. I know some people will cut the Tearlament to play a second Scareclaw in the deck, but personally, I think you actually need the Tearlaments because there's actually a lot of first turn combos where you're trying to find a way to get that third material on your Rise Heart, and if you don't have access to the field spell to pop your Shangri-Ira to then use that material to go under the Rise Heart, then being able to tutor out something like the Tearlaments from your deck while you have Rise Heart makes it to where once you mill, they'll get banished, and of course that triggers the Rise Heart and gives you that extra material that you might need. It's not the most relevant thing, but I like having access to it in the deck, and again, they're both extenders, so you know, what the heck, why not? So a pretty small package for the most part, but again, pretty standard. For the last monster in the deck, and I'm sure to nobody's surprise, is 3 copies of Ash Blossom and Joy Spring. I just think this is the most generic and versatile hand trap in the game right now. I actually thought this card would be really average this format, but the more and more I've been playing, there's actually so many critical moments in this format with any deck really that you go against that Ash Blossom can actually come in very, very clutch, and the fact that you can use it under a Rise Heart as well makes it to where it fits perfectly in this deck. Oh, and one quick note, of course, I'm not playing Shifter. I definitely think you could, but there's a lot of decks in this format, including the Mirror, that I feel like I'm going to run into, so I'd rather put it in the side. That way, if it's in the right matchup, it's good, and making my game ones that much better. Now, moving on to the spells, we'll start out with the engine stuff. Of course, we're going to be playing 1 copy of Terraforming to search our 3 fields. field spell. Very similar to Parallel Rhino, it adds you a Kashtira from deck to hand. It also gives you a little boost for every attribute on your field, but of course if you use Shangri-Ira's effect, you can also pop a card on the field, and that's kind of the way we abuse the Arise Heart combo we were talking about earlier. Normally on your opponent's turn, you'll bring out something like a Fenrir with your Shangri-Ira that will trigger your field spell, and you'll use it to actually pop your Shangri-Ira. Shangri-Ira protects itself from destruction, so you can detach whatever's left. That material gets banished. Of course, Arise Heart will trigger, then you get your third material. Pretty straightforward and easy. After the field spell, we have 3 of the Theosis. I've heard some people want to cut it to 2, and I guess I could understand it because it requires you to have a monster on the field, but I feel like this is just one of the best cards, if not the best card in the deck. It's a teleport. It recurs all your banished cards back to hand. It's so good what it can do. I'm not saying you have to play 3, especially if you have budgetary reasons, but again, I think if you have access to it, this card, in my eyes, should definitely be played at 3. For the last Kashtira spell, we are playing 3 of the Birth. Again, another card you could be playing 2 of, but personally, I just always want to draw this card. It really helps in any scenario in the game. It's a great combo piece. It's a great extender. There's really no complaints I have about this card, except for, I guess, it's once per turn, so if you draw multiples, you're a little sad. I think the reason a lot of people are actually playing 2 this is for that reason. But when you do the math, really going from 3 to 2, the math isn't that crazy different of opening multiples, so I don't know. I personally think this is one of the best cards in the deck, and I'd rather draw multiples than not draw it at all, but that's just me. So that's it for the Kashtira spells, but moving on to the non-engine supporting stuff, we have 3 copies of Pot of Prosperity, one of the best consistency cards in the game, and the fact that this deck can abuse it the best, because again, you don't really draw cards, and the fact that the extra deck monsters you banish, you can actually start reattaching to a Rise Heart for extra effects, makes it to where in my eyes, not only is this already one of the best pot cards in the game, but in this deck specifically, it's pretty crazy. Now, after the Prosperities, I'm playing 2 of my favorite card in the format right now, Triple Tactics Talent. This card has so much application in the format today. It's really one of the best cards going into this format. Whether you're going first and ripping cards or drawing cards, or going second and really just helping you break the board, this card has so much application, especially in the mirror, and it's again one of those cards that really weaken this deck specifically. But again, this is a powerhouse of a card, and I really feel like most decks in this format should be playing it. And while I honestly wanted to play 3, instead I decided to go with 3 Triple Tactics Thrust. Now, people's opinion of this card in this deck specifically is a little hit and miss, and I can definitely understand where people are coming from, but I know personally I've experienced nothing but good things from this card. The fact that you can search any spell or trap in your deck is pretty insane, but I guess the argument to be made is when going first, your opponent normally won't have a monster on the field because you're not really getting hit with Bestials or anything of that nature, but we do have a card in the deck to help mitigate when we are going first. But Thrust really is one of the best board breaker cards in my opinion, because it acts as any board breaker card in your deck essentially. Another thing that makes it so powerful is that going into game 2 and 3, you can also side these spells and traps to help you break boards or set up your first turn combo as well. I could probably do a whole video on this card, and I don't want to dig too much into it, but I really have been loving how the fact that this card not only has been helping me break boards going second, but even if I go first and even if they don't have a monster for me to set, I actually have a pretty decent option to fall back on in the main deck. Now, for the last spell in the deck, to nobody's surprise, I would think, is 3 Book of Eclipse. At first, I thought this card would be really average, but the more I've played it, just like Ash, the more I've actually really liked it. Speaking of Ash, this is something that gets hit by it, so you have to kind of keep that in mind. You might want to bait the Ash before using this. But that being said, this has so much application in the format today, whether it's turning the whole Despia field phase down, or of course turning off the zone locks in the mirror match. I mean, heck, there's even applications against Sprite, especially since Toad can't keep coming back with Elf anymore. There are other options you could be playing, like the Lava Golems or the Evenly matches. But personally, I'm a big fan of versatility, and I think this is just one of the best cards to not only draw as the 6th card per turn, but something that you could easily dig for with Prosperity as well. So for that reason, even though I don't think it's like the most insane card in the format, I definitely think it's earned its spot for how versatile it is in the format today. So that's it for the spells. Now moving on to the traps. Now, to nobody's surprise, we are of course playing 3 copies of Imperm, our second hand trap in the deck. I guess one thing to note is that it is something you can set off of Thrust if you get hand trap going first. It's not the most optimal play, but I guess it is an option. But really what I like to do going first, if I'm getting hand trapped, if they don't commit a monster to the board, then I'm typically just gonna search my 1-of Dimensional Barrier. The more I've been playing this format, the more relevant this card has been, especially now that Elf has gone against Sprite. They're a lot more Exceed reliant in their deck. So being able to call Exceed in Sprite, call Exceed in the Kashtira matchup, call Fusion in the branded matchup, heck, you can even call Synchro in the Sword Soul matchup. There's like literally infinite possibilities for what this card can accomplish right now. So if your opponent just throws a random Ash at you, you know you could punish them big time. Oh, and it's also one of those things where now Thrust helps you get another turn after you've been Nibiru'd, because sometimes you don't always have the extenders to play through it, but being able to Thrust set D barrier really just insulates the fact that now you're going to have the turn passed back to you, making Thrust that much more versatile as a going first card, and of course a great going second card. For the last trap in the deck, nothing too crazy, it's just the Big Bang. Of course you need it for the combo, being able to bring your Exceed materials back to the field. Its on-field effect doesn't come up too often for me, it's very easy to play around, but you know, you gotta play the card. Alright, now moving on to the extra deck, we have a lot of 2-ofs for obvious reasons, you know, the mirror match and all. We have 2 Shangri-Ira, 2 of the Arise Heart, and then I'm also playing 2 Divine Arsenal AA Zeus. I think this is all pretty standard for the most part. You could play 3 of either of the Kashtira monsters if you felt like you needed it, but of course Zeus is at 2 because of Mind Hacker being in the format now. You really just have to make sure that if your opponent were to rip something out, they're not going to go for your Zeus. Speaking of Mind Hacker, of course, this is a really amazing card. I've gone back and forth between 1 and 2. You can test it yourself, but personally I found like I only really use this going first, even though there are its niche applications going second. And of course, if I'm going second and my opponent rips it out of the extra deck, I really don't care because I normally don't use it going second anyway. But regardless, I think going second, I don't see a world my opponent rips this out of my extra deck over something else. But yeah, test it out yourself. Personally, I think 1 is good enough. Ripping your opponent's deck and extra deck apart with this card is obviously really unfair. After that, we have a bunch of little 1-ofs. We have the 1 Big Eye, 1 Draco Sack, and we have the 1 Dark Arm Dragon. Now, some people will opt to play one or the other between these two, but I personally find the kind of removal that these two offer are very different. Again, they're both destruction, but they both have their own purposes, and the fact that the Dark Arm can also rip out multiple cards really can set up some really cool plays. Oh, and one thing to note is the Dark Arm also banishes cards, so you'll banish some of your Theosises or Big Bangs or anything that might be in the graveyard. Cool that it has synergy in that regard as well. But yeah, just remember it can't attack, kind of similar to Draco Sack in that regard. That's it for the Exceeds, but of course moving on to the links, we are of course playing double Lingaribo and 1 of the Furhire. I think the Lingaribo is unfortunately something you have to play 2 of, at least right now with Ibli running around. Whether or not you decide to side or main deck the Ibli yourself, of course you need to have a target for it. But also the last thing you want is to just play the 1, and then when your opponent does rip a card out of your extra deck and give you an Ibli, of course they're just going to rip out that Lingaribo. So by at least playing 2, you give yourself a chance to at least out it. And again, it's still kind of awkward because you'll have a monster on the field, so you can't just freely put a monster on the field. But again, we do have a bunch of extenders in the deck. Plus, with cards like Book of Eclipse, it's very easy to, of course, turn off that Ibli as well, while also turning off your opponent's field. It's why it's one of the best cards right now against the deck. Now, for the last cards in the extra deck, I actually haven't been playing the Infinitrack link. I definitely think going forward you could do it if people are really pivoting towards Dark Hole. But the one thing that I've been doing is playing the 1 Nitis and the 1 Garura. This is something that I freely attach all the time to Arise Heart, and then when they do finally out that Arise Heart, it can be a little devastating because this deck doesn't get a bunch of free advantage. But when they do finally out that Arise Heart, it's very nice having these underneath because it can get you back in tempo in the game, not only removing a card that they control, but then drawing a new card to help you with your follow-up on your next turn. Again, by no means is it something that's completely devastating or nothing you can play around, but it's just one of those things that's super free for this deck to do, so might as well abuse it because, like I said, it's free. So that's it for the main deck. I could go over the side, just comment down below. Let me know if that's something you guys want me to start doing, is potentially talking about side decks, or maybe even making videos completely revolved around side decking. But again, I really feel like this is one of the best decks of the format, and yes, it has its flaws, but every deck in the format does. So is this deck really worth the price tag it's at now? You know, yeah, I would say I would definitely think it's worth picking up this deck. Again, it's not going to be like last Tier Limits format where that's all you can play, so you have to pick it up. But I definitely think if this deck fits into your play style and you really like how this deck goes about its combos and the way it removes cards from the field, then I definitely think it's worth the money for you to invest, because this deck is going to be around for quite a while, especially with all the YCSs coming up in the future. Unfortunately, it's not the most budget deck in the world, but we do have some other budget decks that we can talk about in another video. So what do you guys think? Let me know down below. Do you think this deck is worth the money, or do you think it's just an average deck going into this format? But that being said, I really hope to see you guys on the next episode. Peace.